welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook. For this episode, I'm joined by Toronto-based musician and composer Pete Johnston. What you're listening to now is the Bhikkhu from his album The Songs Which Are, which is under the band name Stranger Still. This album, The Songs Which Are, is all based on the poems of Alden Nolan, who was from Nova Scotia and lived from 1933 to 83. And the vocals you can hear are Mim Adams and Randy Helmers. Thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Pete Johnston. Thanks, Pete Johnston, for joining me for Harmonious World. And I've been listening to Stranger Still and The Songs Which Are, which is a fascinating album, very Canadian, if I may say so, without being insulting in the least. There's a real sense of your culture and everything. So we'll talk about all of that. But thank you for joining me.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks. I'm grateful that you asked.
So Stranger Still is one of your bands, but you have several different sort of alter egos, don't you?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I do. For the long time, I was mostly playing a kind of version of jazz music was what I was interested in composing and playing. And I had a larger moniker I called See-Through Music, which most of my projects were some version of See-Through, however many people were in the band. So I had a See-Through 2 and a 3 and a 4 and all the way up to a 5. And that was just kind of regular collaborators across all the different groups, but it was just kind of a moniker I had. Stranger Still is a very different proposition to me because it's sort of it's very different music. It's not jazz music. I think that's the thing. It's much more clearly kind of composed, coming out of a folk song tradition, but some of the jazz comes in there a little bit, I think. I am curious what struck you as being very Canadian about it.
I don't know. It's really interesting because I've interviewed quite a few Canadian musicians. There's something folkloric about it, but there's the jazz. It's almost like you've taken stuff from your American cousins, but also very much more so from the I don't know what it is about the quality of Canadian life. It feels like it's blooming tough because it seems like it's always snowing in Canada. I'm sure that's not true, but
no. Well, I think you're there are some interesting things about Canadian culture such as it is. It's increasingly hard to define what that is in any way because I live in Toronto now, which is incredibly multicultural. There's we got everybody here, and the sense of me personally coming from Scottish stock way back. My family came to Canada in 1761, so wow. Quite far back. But so we've always obviously maintained a much closer connection to the UK politically, as we know. We had the Queen on our money for a long time. We're about to have the King on our money again, and so we didn't have the violent overthrow that the US did, and the sort of obfuscation of any of that. They cut those ties in lots of ways, and we didn't. But then we're constantly bombarded by American culture as well, for good and for ill. So we get the we got the jazz music and blues and all that African American music's very quickly, like before it made it over to Europe and the UK. So we're just in this kind of liminal space all the time. Yeah. For those of us who are colonizers out of that population from way back, the indigenous peoples, they very much have their own thing happening, and that obviously goes back very far. And then the French culture is a different thing, which I'm not part of. I don't have any of that in my particular tree at all. But they've maintained even much closer cultural and linguistic connections to France and French music than we have, because they've worked really hard to preserve that against the domination of English media and stuff that comes out of America. So French culture, Canadian culture, is a whole other thing that I don't have any part of. But for myself, I've recently had to thought about what it means to not be American, and how much just American culture has been beamed into my brain and everybody else like me over our entire lives, and sort of gone back to looking more at my historical roots. And certainly there's a lot of reckoning here around white people playing jazz music, for lack of a better term. In my personal life and my teaching life, that's been a huge deal. And sort of trying to think through that and what that means and the challenges of that has sort of led me to explore more deeply, my own ancestral heritage and where I come from. And that, of course, led me to Scottish and Scandinavian folk music. That's where I'm coming from. So it was a real kind of process of reflection brought about by larger questions around cultural appropriation, and of course, the injustice to Black Americans and how that plays out in music schools and music genres and everything. It's difficult to navigate.
It is, absolutely. And we talk about cultural appropriation and all of these things, and it's just it is a minefield, but it's a minefield that we should be absolutely trying to navigate. And
100%. And that's I'm very active. Like, I don't take this as a I don't know, as I'm being something taken from me or something, that I can't do this music or whatever. It's really the opposite. It's trying to dig into what maybe I have more of a claim to, which I don't know very much about myself. So to learn more, it's inspiring me to learn more about that and to question what I've just adopted and what I've actively tried to cultivate. And I guess that's it's a real North American thing at the moment. I mean, lots of that obviously happens among different cultures in Europe and in the UK. But us being so close to America, it's challenging, because I do teach. I mean, I teach jazz history. That is one of my jobs.
Right.
And I teach popular music history at a university here, and that's the driving issue, right? It's the relationship between Black and white culture and the exploitation, but also the musical innovation. And anyway, I'm swimming in this stuff.
Absolutely. It's a whole fascinating thing. So I'm very interested in the fact that this album, which is called The Songs Which Are, is based on the poetry of Alden Nolan. Yeah, who's not a poet that I've heard of. How did you come across him?
Well, it's really interesting. He was born in the same town I was during the Depression. I'm from a very small town in Nova Scotia, New Scotland, if you will. It's a town of 3,000 people where I was born and raised and lived. And in that whole time, I'd never heard of Alden Nolan. It's a very working class community, not an artsy community at all. And then when I left, I went to university in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Dalhousie University, and in a second year Canadian literature class, I had to take a class in Canadian literature. There was a poetry unit, and there was a poem by this guy Alden Nolan, and I really liked the poetry. And then it came time to write a final essay, and this is in the 90s. And I said, oh, well, I really like that poem. I'll go back to that. And then I just opened up an encyclopedia. I was like, what? He's from Windsor, Nova Scotia as well? Couldn't believe it. And then, he left in the late 40s. He was there in the Great Depression, and it was during the Second World War and everything. Very brutal, very harsh childhood. Mine was pretty easy, middle class. And he left and moved to New Brunswick and worked as a journalist, and his work as journalism, he started writing poetry very much out of his experience growing up in the Depression and the landscape that was around. And so it's kind of cosmic, I guess. I don't have these kind of experiences very often where the poem resonated with me so much I decided to write an essay about it, and then find out that actually we're from the same place.
Wow, that is amazing, isn't it?
It is. And so he wrote a lot about the Maritimes, but he had a bit of a I don't know. He didn't want to be known as a regional poet. I'm sure that happens in the UK a lot. Like he really wanted to be understood as a Canadian poet, and he didn't. Even though he wrote about the Maritimes and the east coast of Canada and what was around him, he always resented being called a maritime poet. But at the same time, he was very purposeful about his language. He wanted his poetry to be read and understood and possibly appreciated by the people who were around him, who he saw every day. He was very conscious about not writing for an academic audience or a really artistic audience, but still committed to writing poetry. And so it's very East Coast Canada in that kind of way too. But so interestingly, like when he died, or before he died, he donated all of his poetry, all his papers and everything to the University of Calgary, which is in Alberta, like in the west side of Canada. And so, we Maritimers really claim him and haven't, and we don't have access to his work because it's all in Calgary. But he did that purposefully. They offered him more money, which is one, but he didn't want his work to be in a maritime archive, because he figured if it was in another part of the country, he could maybe come to be understood as a Canadian or even global poet rather than a regional one.
Oh, there we go. That's fascinating. So you then took this collection of poetry, and that clearly really resonated with you, and created this collection of works, some of which have very bizarre titles. So tell me what
those are his titles, not mine.
Well, okay, I sort of guessed they were. Tell me what the Bhikkhu is. Bhikku.
That's a good one, and I don't know. There was a Nolan scholar who kind of explained it to me, but I didn't really get it. It's Nolan was very fascinated in kind of the ancient world, and he's got poems about the ancient Egyptians and ancient Greeks, and one of the poems is called I Icarus on the so like that kind of really historical literature storytelling. And he treated the Bible very much in the same way, as like a work of literature that was telling the story of a particular time and place. And so there's tons of biblical references in the music too, including in the poem The Bhikkhu is a very biblical references to Lucifer and such. But yeah, these kind of ancient epics, and he sort of considered the Bible that, I think. So I don't know. I sadly I haven't Googled it to figure out what it is, but it's an unusual word.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to play some tracks from this album during the podcast, and in fact, I started with the Bhikkhu because I liked it. I've actually, while you were talking, I have just Googled it, and it means beggar. It means beggar.
Beggar.
Yeah.
In what language?
Or one who lives by alms. The historical Buddha. It's a Buddhist word, I think.
Oh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so like Eastern, huh?
Yeah. So there we are. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's right. Now you know.
Yeah, because he doesn't use the word in the poem.
No.
Right.
Which is
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, I think one of the concepts in sort of some Eastern mysticism and things is about we're all asking for alms. We're all, and part of what we should be doing is giving alms to people that and sharing things. So maybe that's part of what it's about. So you mentioned,
I feel like I failed your first question there. Oops.
No, absolutely
not having an answer to it, and but it is peculiar.
Well, now next time someone asks you, you can say, "Oh, well, I know what that means."
I'm sure it will happen.
Absolutely. So you mentioned briefly I Icarus, and at this
Mhm.
point in the podcast, I'd like to play an extract from Icarus because I really like it.
Great, thank you.
There was a time when I could fly. I swear it to you now. If I think hard for a moment, I can even tell you the year. My childhood room was on the ground floor at the rear of the house. My bed faced a window, and night after night I lay on my bed and willed myself to fly. There was a time when I could fly. I swear it to you now. It was hard work, I can tell you. Sometimes I lay still for an hour before I felt my body rising slowly up from the bed. I rose until I floated 4 feet above the floor, then moving like a swimmer, I propelled myself out the window.
So tell me how you took the words. I'm very interested when people are inspired by poetry. I'm very interested in how you adapted that text into your music.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the second album I've done of this. So there's a previous one with 11 tunes, and I'm a kind of systematic composer where I come up with something for one poem, however I'm going to set it, and then I just try and make sure I do something different the next time, and then something different the next time after that, and something different the next time after that. So it's not to, as I'm sure you've noted in listening to it, to just sort of treat them as songs, like melodies that are done in the way of folk songs, which I deeply love, but they're different settings for each of them. And for this record that we're talking about now, in the first record, I really looked for poems that felt like verses, that had like 3 or 4 verses that it could easily kind of map onto a song. And that's what I did. So I had these longer poems that looked like they could break down into verses in the way we would expect a song to. But this one, I had a few of those, but I also wanted to do some really short ones. So you brought up the Biku earlier, and that's a very short poem. And so I took that as a challenge to like, how can I make a kind of, longish 2-3 minute long piece out of 4 or 5 lines of text, right?
Yeah.
So that was just kind of a craft kind of challenge for that piece. If we're talking Icarus, one thing I did there is took a line of the poem that I thought would kind of function as a chorus that could be repeated a bunch of times to give the poem its characters. So in the song, it's there was a time when I could fly, I swear it, and I just thought that was a nice refrain, and I just plugged that and put it between each of the stanzas of the poem to kind of, there's basically three stanzas of the poem, and I just kind of put that line as a chorus in a kind of pretty traditional, British Isles folk music kind of way, that chorus. But I did change the words a little bit, because in the poem he just says, there was a time when I could fly, I swear it, and that didn't kind of work rhythmically. So in the song I put, there was a time when I could fly, I swear it to you now, and that sort of added a kind of a rhythmic thing that kind of set it up and made it feel to me more like a kind of chorus refrain, like kind of Greek chorus refrain there, and then and then you get the response. So a few times I've had to shorten lines or added a couple extra words to make it work rhythmically. I really try to do that as little as possible because I don't want to mess with the words, but every now and then you got to add something or shorten it to kind of make it map on. And certainly when you're writing a melody because poets don't think of this, right? Songwriters always think they have the melody first and then you come up with words that map onto the melody, right? That's what you do.
Yeah.
But now I've got the words and I come up with a melody I like, and if I want to repeat that melody, sometimes the poems don't cooperate as much as you would like, and so you have to swap them out a little bit.
Right. Yeah. Well,
does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suspect that as a poet, he would just be grateful that somebody was interested in his poetry and using it in a different way. And actually,
well, he was also a very big music fan. He loved country music, and I also love country music. Like, he was a big Johnny Cash fan and met Johnny Cash and wrote very lovingly about his meetings and performance with country musicians. And I've talked to his son. His son is still living, and yeah, his son said he just always had country music and British, folk songs on. He loved all that stuff. So that he would have been, whether he liked what I did exactly or not, he would have liked the idea that somebody was putting his poetry to music.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me about how you got the people together. So you've got this collection of songs, and are these people who you've worked with before? So the particularly the singers, and are they people that you have worked with?
Yeah, a little bit. Like, I play guitar on the record and wrote the tunes, but I'm really a bass player. You can see in the background here I have a double bass. That's what I studied and played kind of professionally. It's only kind of recently I've started playing guitar. But one of my when I moved to Toronto 20 years ago, again from the small town, and immediately fell in love with a bass player here named Rob Clutton, who the first time I heard him, I just said, this is the best bass playing I've ever heard. This is I just love everything he does. And I got very fortunate to introduce myself to him, and we became friends. And so I still go hear him every time I can. His own records are incredible. Your listeners should check out. He's got some solo double bass records. And anyway, so when I was putting this project together, I was writing all the songs on guitar, and I was going to play bass myself. And then I thought, well, I've got them all figured out on guitar. Why don't I just play guitar, and I should have a bass player? And I thought, well, this is my opportunity. I can actually play music. As bass players, we don't get to play with each other ever, right?
Right.
Horn players, guitar players, drummers. Bass players and drummers, we don't get to play with each other because you're usually only one in a band, right? So I just took it as an opportunity to ask him if he would play, and I'm just so grateful that he did. He's one of my favorite artists and a incredible guy. So that happened. So that was, as a music nerd, I was just very enthusiastic to have this chance to play with one of my heroes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And then luckily, Rob's wife is an incredible singer, Randy Helmers. So she's the other singer on the record. So they had a duo of just bass and voice that I really love too. They do Shakespearean sonnets. So he plays bass and she sings, and he set the Shakespearean sonnets for just voice and double bass.
Oh, wow.
And they haven't recorded it yet, but I keep bugging them to record it because it's so good. Anyway, so they already had a thing going, and I love her voice. She has Norwegian heritage, so she's sort of connected to that Scandinavian sound singing, and she knew that tradition, which was a big part of what I was doing. And then the fourth member is a woman named Mim Adams, who was a bit of a wild card because I knew Rob and Randy pretty well. I knew Mim pretty well, but they didn't know each other and they hadn't played any music together and came from different scenes. Mim has played some rock music, but she's a great swing and jazz singer. And so I just kind of got us together, and just immediately I was just thrilled that their voices just worked so well together just immediately from the first note. The resonance was there, and most importantly, they seemed to like each other, and so everybody got along. And but that's thing, you never know how two voices are going to interact until you hear it. I had in my mind, I knew her voice, I knew Randy's voice, and just luckily it rang out. I think it sounds nice. Yeah,
it sounds like you've all played together forever. I thought you were going to say that you'd all been a different ensemble for a long time, because that's what it sounds like.
That's great. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I mean, we did get to do, it was very lucky. This is so rare for me these days that before we recorded this new album, we got to do a tour. We played eight or nine shows on the East Coast of Canada. So we got to tour and play these songs in front of audiences and then go into the recording studio, which is how all records used to be made. But now it's really hard to do that. It's hard, especially in Canada, touring is basically impossible. It always has been very difficult just because the distances between places and there's no money, and it's it just takes hours to get to the next place, and it's very expensive to do. So, but we made it happen, and and I think as a result, the record kind of can sound that way, that we kind of have our music together.
Yeah,
I hope it sounds that way.
No, it definitely does. It really does. I mean, I could go on for hours, Pete, but thank you so much.
Clearly, I could as well.
Yeah. No, but thank you so much for your time. It's been really, really interesting to talk to you about this album. So thank you.
Well, I'm really grateful, and I'll have to check some of your podcasts where you talk to other Canadian musicians to see what they have to say, because my experience is fairly typical for where I'm from, but certainly Indigenous or French musicians and composers would have very different take on things. And it's a wide world out here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate it, Hillary, and everything that you do. The podcast is great interviews. I'm trying to get caught up, but there's so many. I've got a lot. I've got a very long car drive ahead of me to go out to Nova Scotia from Toronto. So you'll be I'll be listening as I go.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Really good to talk to you. Thanks, Pete. Okay. Bye.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Almost from the moment friends separate, or lovers each becomes somebody else.
Thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World and for listening to my conversation with Pete Johnston. Don't forget that you can subscribe to Harmonious World, which gives you access to a monthly subscriber-only podcast episode and a weekly email. In that weekly email, I'll bring you information about forthcoming guests, perhaps some behind-the-scenes moments from previous guests. But thank you once more for joining me for Harmonious World. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hillary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.